How's everybody doing this morning? They're doing all right? Okay. So I think last time I was here, I told you to make sure you have Brody do the Brody Shuffle. So I don't know if he has done that yet. That was one of his famous moves in college that we got to see a lot, usually if he scored a goal or something else. I will tell you this. In soccer, he is definitely a better penalty kick taker than myself. I was always scared of them, and I was terrible at it. And Brody was willing every time to step up, a man of confidence. He would go in and would take that kick. So it was great times, good memories from college. And I appreciate him letting me speak with you today. And, that's an honor. So growing up as a preacher's kid, my dad would preach and, basically I heard him every Sunday go, and there are not many times that he would give that up and let somebody else preach. So I do take that as an honor to be able to speak today to you. So hopefully I'll be an encouragement. This is supposed to be an encouragement to Solid Christian Church, okay? And exciting, as you said, this is starting, you guys have been here for how long now? 4 years. So exciting times. And so we're going to just talk about kind of the church, right? And how Jesus kind of set this up and how it has taken off and how it is kind of navigated through the last 2,000 years. I know last time I was here, I took us through a whole chapter in 1 Corinthians, a little long. I'm not doing that this time. But we're going to be in Matthew 16, so Matthew 16, 13 through 18. Okay, and I'm going to read the passage, and this is kind of our launching point for where we're going. Okay, and I might have to interchange in between glasses and not. I'm getting to that age where it gets a little. Every now and then, you have to kind of wear glasses or not. So the lighting, we'll see here. Okay, when Jesus came to the region, so I'm in verse 13 of chapter 16 in Matthew. It says, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? So you remember, Jesus just got done feeding thousands of people. He's been doing these miracles. Jesus kind of going around, he's been hanging out with these disciples for a while, right? So he gets to that point, kind of asks, hey, what do the people say? Who do they say I am? Okay? And they say, well, the disciples reply to Jesus. They say, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, and others say Jeremiah or one of the other prophets, right? So everybody out there is kind of thinking, okay, this is one of those prophets that we've heard about, or they've come back to life. Some thought Jeremiah came back to life, right? And they're going through, and the disciples are kind of listing off that. Think about if you asked, your family members, your friends, like, what do people think of me, right? It could be a little scary thinking about that. Okay, so Jesus, and maybe you could say, hey, what do other people think of me? That might be okay. That's kind of that surfacey, everybody out there. But next, Jesus turns out and he says, then he asks them, but who do you say I am? Right? What do you think your family or your close friends would say about you? Right? If you ask that, hey, what do you say I am? Like who do you think I am? You see me, they've been traveling with Jesus. They've had a lot of close encounters with him. And so Jesus is asking his disciples, who do you think I am, basically? Who do you think I am? And Simon Peter answers here in verse 16. He says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus replied, you are blessed, Simon, son of John, because my Father in heaven has revealed this to you. You did not learn this from any human being. Now I say to you that you are Peter, which means rock, and upon this rock I will build my church, and all the powers of hell will not conquer it. All right, so this is where we get what everybody calls Peter's confession, right? And Peter's confession is foundational to the church, right? It's the starting point of the gospel message that unites churches all over the world, right? And the gospel message is this, and this is really a pivotal point in Jesus' time on earth. This is when he starts to kind of say, okay, Peter gets it. I'm here. I'm God's son, right? I was sent here to live a life human in the flesh. He's going to die. He's going to conquer death, and he's going to rise again, right? That's the gospel message. There's a guy, he was here, Jesus. He lived, he died, he rose from the grave, right? He conquered that. And Peter's confession is pivotal to that because it's saying that, hey, this is my Lord and Savior. This is the guy that I'm going to follow, right? He's my Lord, Lord of my life. There's different phrases that people use. And so I think it's important that you see that. Jesus, right away when Peter says this, Jesus is like, you got it, right? You've got it. This is what I was trying to get at after these time we've been together, that you realize that I'm Messiah. I'm not one of these prophets that already had been here. I'm not Jeremiah coming back. No, this is God's Son. That's there. Dr. R.C. Sproul, he writes this in his commentary, Mark. He says, the church stands strong and unconquerable as long as it remains committed to its confession that Jesus is the Christ. A loss of confidence as to the identity of Jesus does not disrupt merely the external trappings of the church. It disrupts the church's foundation. We who confess the name of Christ must remain firm in our conviction that he is God in the flesh. Okay? And so it's important, this idea, it's important to the church. All right, so verse 18 is kind of where I want to zero in on. If you look back there, there's a couple words that I just want to kind of unpack for a second. In there, so again, it says this, I'll read it again. It says, verse 18, now I say to you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and all the powers of hell will not conquer it. So rock, so what is rock? Rock, the Greek word for rock here is Petra, or Petros. Petra is the noun version of it. It means bedrock, suitable to be a foundation for a large building. A lot of times we call this the cornerstone. They used to be the cornerstone was kind of that main stone that needed to be laid first, that everything else was kind of built upon. And in the ancient times back here, when Jesus was talking, the cornerstone marked the geographical location by orienting a building in a specific direction. So that stone kind of pointed those builders, when they built that building, this is the direction we're going. This is what is going on. And so I think that's important here because Jesus is trying to make that point to his disciples and to Peter, right? It's this idea that this confession, which again, this is before, Jesus is still on earth. He hasn't died. They haven't even really comprehended everything is about ready to take place, right? They think, hey, this guy's coming in. He's going to change the world. This is great. He's going to rule forever. Not realizing that not too long after this, he's going to die, right? In those 3 long days that they had with Jesus in the grave before he arose again, right? They don't completely comprehend that, but Jesus understands. He's laying this groundwork in the cornerstone to his ministry and to what his message is that what Peter's saying, his confession, that this idea, this gospel message is the rock that we all hold to. All right, and then the second wording here is the church, right? It says the church. Ecclesia is the Greek. It means called out. This doesn't refer to a building. That doesn't mean this building right here is the church, but it's rather the people who make up that community, right? So ecclesia is called out, those that are called out, right? And I think this is interesting because I think for a lot of what the disciples were thinking back then is that Jesus was going to set up this kind of kingdom and he's going to rule on earth, and it's more of politics and everything else, right? And it was about, no, this is about people. People is what matters the most. Again, we go back to the gospel message here as Jesus was starting this, making sure, kind of nailing it with the disciples so they understood this idea of the gospel, right? This is the common ground that in churches, when I talk about churches, all different churches, right? This is what hopefully is the center point to every church, is the gospel message, okay? And then that is there. We have some differences and different things, and some churches like certain ways, some others like different, but hopefully when you take all that away, is the gospel message still there, right? And that's kind of the glue and everything that holds the churches together. All right, but at the end of verse 18, there's something else that he says. He makes a promise. Jesus makes a promise to his disciples, but also to the church, and even to solid Christian church here as well. It says this. His promise is that, he says, and all the powers of hell will not conquer it. Right? Nothing's going to stop it. Okay? Not even Jesus' death that's coming, not even the disciples' deaths that's coming. Nothing that happens is going to stop it. The church is going to continue on. Right? And again, I think about back then, they're probably not even really figuring this all out, right? They're kind of just like, all right, well, yeah, whatever, this is great. We're here. And I don't think until you start looking at the rest of the New Testament that you see this promise lived out over and over. And I think if you even look at, the time that we've been here and experiences with church, everything else, that you see that Jesus' promise continues to live out. Because you got to realize Jesus didn't predict a place here. He's not saying I'm going to build my church. He wasn't talking about a place. He was talking about a people, a movement, and an assembly, right? A gathering that was going to take place. And so think about today. We're a part of this gathering, right? We're a part of the church that Jesus established back then, 2,000 years ago. And so as Jesus was preparing those disciples for what was next, right? They go through, and in a few weeks here, we're going to celebrate Easter, right? Which is the Super Bowl for any Christian. This is our Super Bowl of Christ rising again, right? We get to celebrate his resurrection. And after that resurrection, Jesus kind of sets them in kind of a direction that he wants them to go. Right? This happens, and we call it the Great Commission, okay, in Matthew 28, 18 through 19. It says, Jesus came and told his disciples. So Jesus he died, he rose again, he's back, he's been hanging out kind of with the disciples. He gets there, and he kind of gives them some last words here, and he says, I've been given all authority in heaven and on earth. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Teach these new disciples to obey all the commands I have given you. And be sure of this, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age. So Jesus again says, I'm with you always. That's his promise to the church. He's going to be with us. So you might be sitting here asking, this is 2,000 years ago. How did it survive? He left this to 12 men that a lot of people would say probably weren't the most influential or the most maybe savvy at talking all the time, or you kind of, if you watch The Chosen, if anybody's watched The Chosen in here, you kind of see these guys depicted in different ways in there, right? These are not the most gifted individuals, right? But it's the ones that God used to establish his church. And so we might say, hey, why are we here? How is the solid Christian church is here? How do we get to this point? And I think it goes back to verse 18 here, where it says, Jesus says, he makes them a promise, right? Nothing's going to stop this church. I'm going to build this church. Nothing is going to stop it. And so as we get into Acts, you see something interesting, right? The central teaching to the early church was that we believed something happened, not that we believed something is true. Right? So there's a difference there. It wasn't to say, hey, we believe this is true, that this took place, which a lot of it might be what we do today. But back in the early church, they believed something happened. They knew something happened, right? And it's kind of interesting. You look at this. We're Acts 2, 22 and through 24, and then verse 32. I'm going to read it here. And you see them, they're really talking about, like, we saw this happen. Like, we know that Jesus rose from the grave. They're not talking about, like, this is something that happened over here that a couple people said. Here's what it says here. It says, fellow Israelites, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. This man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. But God raised him from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death, because it was impossible for death to keep its hold on him. Then in verse 32, it says, God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of it. Right? A lot of them witnessed it. A lot of them saw it. They saw Jesus after he rose again. And that was important. That was that catalyst that took the early church and continued to grow. Could you just imagine if you were hanging out with Jesus, he predicts his own death, he dies, and 3 days later comes back and he's hanging out with you again, right? It would change your life, okay? And that's these men, that's what happened. And they went out and started spreading the gospel message. All right, but something interesting happens. You get close to Acts 9, right? So somewhere in there, you've had Stephen the martyr, the first martyr in Acts 7. Some things kind of go on. And then all of a sudden, there's kind of some not much movement, right? You just say that. Maybe it's kind of some steam's been let out. Whatever you want to say, it's just kind of slowing down. Okay? In Acts 9, Jesus recruits Paul. Jesus himself comes back and recruits Paul. And so if you look at Acts 9, you see that he comes to him, all right? Paul's on his way, and everybody remembers Paul. He used to be Saul, so it was Saul before Paul. So Saul, he's killing Christians. He's locking Christians up. He was very much like, this isn't the way, right? He was trying to stop the gospel message. Understand that. Here's a guy that is against what Jesus set out to do, to build his church. Saul was against it. And Jesus meets him on the road to Damascus. Jesus meets him and says, hey, I want you to be a messenger for me. I want you to go spread the good news, the gospel message. Okay, and so as that happens, right, he's kind of blinded, and Jesus tells him where to go, and then the Lord speaks to Ananias in verse 15 and says, go, this man is my chosen instrument to proclaim my name to the Gentiles and their kings and to the people of Israel. All right, so here's this man, Saul, who was persecuting the church and killing and locking up Christians, believers, trying to stop the gospel message that Jesus has an encounter with and changes his life. All right, and Saul, who becomes Paul now, is one of the biggest, one of the all-stars of the New Testament, but it also, he poured everything he had, right, into sharing the gospel, and we're going to look at that in a second. But here's what's interesting, I think we need to take note of, is this, that Jesus, his promise that nothing's going to stop his church. Jesus is so committed to building the local church that he interrupts plans and careers to build his church. Let me say that again. That Jesus is so committed to building the local church that he interrupts plans and careers to build his church. All right, so it's interesting. My family used to live in Colorado. Back in, it's been 10 years ago we moved there, 11 years ago. And just had a job out there, worked at a community college. We lived in Canyon City. And a couple years into that, Joanna and I had talked about, hey, we didn't really feel like they had a church that really fit us, and really felt like, maybe God was, saying maybe we should, help start a church, but we didn't really, weren't too fired up about it, but we thought, well, maybe God's kind of talking to us. And a friend of mine had told another couple that we didn't know at the time that God had kind of told them that. And this lady, this couple, the lady messages Joanna and says, hey, we had heard that you were interested in maybe starting a church. Would you like to talk to us? And so I can still remember this. They came over to our house. We sat down, the four of us, and just said, okay, what's God telling you? And we told them what God was telling us, and sure enough, like everything like fit, right? Like the same things they were like saying, hey, God's telling us that we want to reach, we were young men and married young men and people that that don't feel comfortable going into a church building and just all the stuff that both of us, we kind of from both couples felt like this is something we're maybe supposed to do. And I can tell you right now, we had no real formal training on anything. We did a lot of things wrong, okay? But we just said, let's just start meeting. So we started meeting in a house, and all of a sudden we said, well, we're getting a little bit too big for the house. Let's meet in a community building. So we met in a community building, and then eventually, I don't know if it was maybe close to a year later, 9 months to a year, moved into a school, right? And so we launched in Super Bowl Sunday in 2016. We launched Catalyst Church, right? Us two couples, this was not our thing, this was God's thing, right? And I wasn't working in the church, I was doing something else, but felt like God was just do this, right? And so we started this church. And they're still going strong today. They're still making an impact in their community, and it's been amazing to see just what that church has been able to do, right? And it just started off with a few couples, families that got together in there. What's interesting to that, I should have mentioned at the first, was interesting is that 2 years before the church started, there was somebody else in town that God had told them, hey, you're supposed to start a church. Here's what you're supposed to be and supposed to do, right? And he had been kind of in ministry at another church there, and he kind of put God to the side. It was like, I'm not really, I don't know if I can do that. It's not really, and had all these excuses, right? And he heard our story and kind of watched kind of back a little bit of like, oh my goodness, this is the church that God told me to plant, right? And so he ends up coming on to staff at Catalyst Church as our minister. But it was cool how God used all of the different people and things and put this together, right? And I think it's a great example of Jesus' promise that nothing is going to stop the church. He's going to build his church. He's going to continue to grow it. It doesn't matter what we do. And you look at stories even others. You look at C.S. Lewis's life and how God changed that later on and what impact he's had. Alice Cooper, if anybody of you knows who Alice Cooper is, God changed his life. I might just dare say Justin Bieber, right? He's had his life changed, and he's put a lot of things out there about it. Even a guy named Chuck Colson, right, who started a prison fellowship, became a believer while in prison. The stories go on and on. But one I had to tell that I know, since this is a special day, St. Patrick. I don't know how many of you really know the story of St. Patrick. Okay, and just one of them. So I read through his, he wrote kind of like a book or a letter called Confessio, right? Confessions that St. Patrick wrote. But it's interesting. He tells a story in there that I just wanted to share because I think it's this idea again that when God says he's going to build his church and nothing's going to stop it, he means it. All right, so about the age 16, he was taken into prison. Okay, so some pirates came to where he lived, took him back to Ireland. Okay, so he was kind of a slave, a servant for these people, kind of worked out in the fields and different other things, so he was not in his homeland, right? It was back more in Britain in that area. And so he goes back and he's in captivity. These people have captured him, and others, a lot of people were captured. And he really at 16 did not have a close relationship with God. I think there were some things in there where he was kind of, he knew of him, but was not wasn't close. And it was through this time that he was in captivity that he started praying a lot. He started really reflecting on his life and his relationship with Jesus. And he talks about that through this letter that he wrote. All right? But he's on there, he kept praying, God, I want to go back. I want to go back home. I want to go back home. And so one day God tells him, hey, you go get on this ship. He told him kind of the name of the ship, said, hey, go get on this ship. okay, in this town. They'll take you home. So he just leaves what he's doing out in the fields and goes 200 miles he travels to get to the ship. When he gets to the ship is they're all pagans. They're just like these very terrible people. Okay, and they're like, get away from here. You're not getting on this boat with us, right? And he's kind of like, no, God told me I was supposed to be on this boat, and they kind of laughed at him, and they tell him to go away. So he goes away back into town. He's praying like, God, I thought you told me I was supposed to be on this boat. And then all of a sudden he hears voice. Somebody tell him, go back to the ship. You need to go back to the ship. And sure enough, they're like, all right, you can get on here, but like, we don't want to hear about any of your stuff that you're doing, and just you can have a ride, basically. Okay, and so he worked for these guys on this boat as they went back. So they were 3 days in the sea. They land. Now I don't know all this of why, like where they landed. I don't think they like shipwrecked, but wherever they landed, they weren't close to where they were supposed to be. Okay, they wandered in the wilderness for 28 days. They had no food. 28 days, or the food runs out. Okay, so on the 28th day, he writes that they're starving. And so these guys, these pagans, start mocking him and saying, well, you know, if you had a God, he would feed us and all this. And St. Patrick tells them, like, believe in Jesus. Like, Jesus is Lord. He is real. And they're like, well, if that's true, then have him bring, food, or have him bring something, so feed us because we're hungry. And so St. Patrick prays, and right then a group of pigs show up on the trail that they're walking on. A group of pigs. He said they slaughtered them, and they sat there and ate them for days, ate these pigs, right? And it was through that these pagans turned to Christ. Okay? And so he goes home to Britain and gets back with his family later on. And guess what God does? He tells them, you go back to Ireland. His parents begged him to stay. Don't go back. Don't go back. And God told him, you need to go back to Ireland and share the good news, right? The gospel message. And so he went back. He went back to there, and all then the stories and kind of the things that his life of him traveling around Ireland and sharing the gospel message. Pretty cool. So especially on a day like this that we get to celebrate him, right? It is this idea that Jesus is so committed to building the local church that he interrupts the plans and careers to build his church. Just want you to remember that. So if we get back to Paul now he's kind of like on fire, right? He is kind of like, hey, I'm going out. I'm going to start sharing the news with everybody. So remember, this kind of stuff had kind of stalled out a little bit. And so Paul kind of goes to the disciples, and I don't know if this is what he said, but a lot of it you see in the New Testament. Paul goes and says, hey, all right, you, Peter, you guys take kind of Jerusalem, and right there, I'm going to start going out to like the rest of everything else, right? I'll take everything else that's around. Okay, and so Paul goes out and has these amazing experiences, right? And he's going in there, he's getting thrown out of cities, he's having to sneak out, right? He's getting stoned, he's getting stones are getting thrown at him. So, but he's also like, all of these things are happening to him, right? He's getting persecuted, and he just continues, okay? And so he gets locked up in Rome. So his first time in prison in Rome, Paul writes this in Philippians 1:12. So he's in there. He says this, now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me, which is locked up in Rome. So he's there. Nero's got him locked up. He says, what's happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel, right? Paul never viewed his confinement as a barrier to the gospel, but rather a catalyst for wider impact. Okay, so Paul is, so again, they're trying to silence the main guy, but what happens? Oh, is this my cue? You stand up? Oh wait, just making sure. Am I running over time, or how long does Brody go? Does he go for a while? Okay. Okay. But what's interesting is that nothing can stop it, right? Even Paul being locked up, he's saying, hey, the gospel is advancing even faster, even better, right? Being locked up. What an attitude to have. So eventually he gets released. Okay, Paul gets a couple more years out. Some say that this is the time he took his trip to Spain and preached the gospel message there. All right, but a few short years later, Paul gets back in prison. Okay, he's locked up again in Rome. And this time it's going to be his last. Right? And I think he knows this. I think he knows that, hey, this is probably not the time I'm going to be released. It's interesting here. Hans Finzel, in his book Empowered Leaders, he writes this about how Paul spent his final days, right? So his final days as he's locked up, this is how he writes it. He says this. He says, any visitor to Rome learns immediately that St. Peter's Church is at the center of the city's attractions. Like magnets, the Vatican, St. Peter's Basilica, and the beautiful museums that surround it draw millions to this ancient city each year. I visited Vatican Square, toured St. Peter's Cathedral, and spent a half a day in the Vatican Museum. I was especially impressed by the works of Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel. However, what inspired me most by my visit to Rome happened after I left those great buildings and that rich history. As impressive as they are, there was something more special in store. On an obscure side street, a few kilometers from the Vatican, there's a small building thought to house the prison cell where Paul spent his final days. Whether it is actually his prison cell or not is, of course, debatable. We climbed down into the cramped hole beneath the ground and spent about a half an hour in the dark cell. It was cold, damp, and musty. A small grate in the ceiling allowed a little daylight to shine through. Historians agree that Paul probably lost his life around AD 67 when Nero ruled. And as I sat on that cold stone floor, I imagined what it must have been like for Paul in those last days. If this wasn't the exact room, it had to be just like it. What a way to spend your final weeks, as we stood in the cell and talked, drinking in the story that the stones could tell if they spoke. We noticed that only a few visitors climbed down into the cell with us. This was in stark contrast to the thousands who waited in line to enter the Vatican Museum not far away. The streets above were filled with tourists who were flocking to St. Peter's Cathedral, but only occasionally did someone stop long enough even to peer through the grate down into the cell. I thought to myself, here is where the man who wrote the greatest portion of the New Testament spent his last days. The greatest missionary and church planter of the first century died here. Wouldn't more people want to feel what it was like for him? Obviously, the answer is no. Most people visiting Rome today do not list Paul's cell as one of their top 10 tourist sites. But for me, it ranked as the number one spot in Rome. All right, so Paul spent his last days, right, in this old, kind of musty, very dark cell. And if you want to read something, to me, I feel is very powerful, is go read 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy, they say, is probably one of the last letter he wrote was this time that he was in this cell. He knew he was going to die, right? He spread the gospel and everything else. And 2 Timothy is written. Just go and read it. It's great with that understanding. But just imagine, if you will, for a second, he probably at some point heard the prison guards coming. He knew he was going to be taken away, right? And you wonder if he thought to himself, I know I would in that situation, and I don't know, maybe it wasn't long, but you wonder, did he think to himself, was it worth it? Like all this that I just did, was it worth it? Did I make a difference? Is this, when Jesus says he's going to build his church, nothing to stop it, is that true? So Paul gets executed as the what I just read. They believe in Nero's circus in 67 A.D., right? Nero's circus was where Nero, the emperor, he basically brought Christians and others. They would kill these Christians and have all these wild killing animals and all sorts of things, right? It's their entertainment that they used, right? And so Paul was beheaded there as well. Peter was also martyred there. He was hung upside down on a cross. And so both Paul and Peter died in Nero's circus. All right, so later the Roman Colosseum, not too long after, the Roman Colosseum replaced Nero's circus, right? So that became the new kind of draw, the entertainment, but replaced that, where the same types of things would happen of martyring Christians and others. And don't you know, so you think about the Roman Empire and everything that had happened, right? I mean, you're thinking about Paul's dies, it's like, man, Romans are like powerful, right? We're the ones trying to spread the gospel and this message. And you'd have to think back then, you think, how powerful is Rome? Well, let me tell you this. So in the Roman Colosseum, there's 80 gates, right? 76 of them are numbered, and there's 4 that are not. So the 4 are, 1 is for the gladiators to go through, 1 was for the emperor, and 2 for VIPs. And over the emperor's gate hangs a cross. Now, if you go there, you can see it. There's a cross that hangs there, right? So in the 1700s, Pope Benedict XIV placed a cross there as a sign to kind of show and remember the Christian martyrs that had come before, right? But this cross doesn't represent them. It really represents one person that died on a cross, Jesus, right? And so in the emperor's gate hangs a cross. Do you think Paul, if you could just tell Paul, hey, Paul, you're not going to believe it, but eventually there's going to be a cross that hangs there where the emperor would come through to the Roman Colosseum or to Nero's circus. See, because when Jesus makes a promise that nothing is going to stop the church, he means it. All right? And so even this many years later, 2,000 years later, as a solid Christian church is here, hopefully you take with it those words of understanding that nothing's going to stop it. You start a church, you keep going, you're sharing the gospel message. It doesn't matter what comes. Nothing is going to stop it. So I'm going to finish up with this from Corinthians 15:58, right? And these are the words of Paul that I want you to take with you today. And it says this, it says, "Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourself fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain." So remember, there is a cross that hangs above the emperor's gate. Let's pray. Dearly Father, we just thank you for the promise that Jesus gave that day, saying that the gospel message that Jesus is Lord, that nothing is going to stop the church. And so we take that promise with us every day as we share your word with others and the message. Pray that you just give us opportunities to share that message, to be out there and to be the light that others that are in the darkness can see. And so just pray for solid Christian church, that you continue to grow and move the church, and that you just encourage those here that to keep up the good work, right? And to know that nothing is going to stop the advancement of the gospel. And so we love you and praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.